Well, welcome. It's good to have you with us. Today, I have the pleasure of being joined by Dr Alisdair Munro, and we're going to be talking about all things family, all things church, all things medical. And yes, we're going to talk about COVID-19, the implications upon us as Freedom Church, but also about us as our families and how we go from here. So if you want the answers to your burning questions, who knows, we might be able to answer them here today. We'll have a good go. But first of all, welcome to you, Ali. It's good to have you with us.
Thank you for having me.
I know you're a busy man, and we really appreciate you giving up some of your holiday time this week to be with us. But first of all, just tell us a bit, how did you get involved with Freedom Church?
Well, it was when Becky and I actually used to live in West Australia for a couple of years. We'd been down in Bournemouth before that, and I'd been working up there. We were both working there, and when we came back, we were looking for somewhere to live, to sort of settle down. Becky was pregnant at the time. And I'd got a job working in the Hampshire region. I'm a doctor and we move around hospitals. So we're looking for somewhere sort of fairly central, near family. And, you know, Romsey was lovely. We both liked it and started renting a house. And we're looking for a church online and had tried a few different places and came across Freedom Church and came and liked what we saw, and we stayed, and the rest, as they say, is history.
Well, we like what we see as well, and it's good having you part of the church family. It's good to have not just you, but Becky as well, and Ethan, who's now 3.
He is 3.5, yes.
And Finlay, your lockdown baby.
The lockdown baby, yes.
How's that been, having a baby in lockdown?
To be honest, I think having a baby in lockdown is probably not that much different to having a baby outside of lockdown because you know, when you've got a newborn, you're sort of penned in much of the day anyway. I think being the thing that was tough was being pregnant during lockdown. Actually, for Becky, that was really hard because she was obviously one of what was at the time called the vulnerable group, and she wasn't allowed to see anybody, to have any contact, with anyone outside of our family for. How long was it? 4 months.
Wow. Yeah.
And that was hard, particularly because, you know, she had Ethan to look after as well, and you get pretty big and sore later on during pregnancy, and trying to do that all by yourself was really tough. And I think, you know, just the stuff you like to enjoy when you're pregnant, looking forward to having a baby and talking about it, and you know, baby showers and all that sort of stuff. It was a shame for her to miss out on that, but. You know, he's 12 weeks old now, and it's been lovely getting to know him as as he grows and develops, and hopefully starts to learn how to sleep a bit better.
I've only ever seen pictures. I look forward to meeting him in person.
I know, yeah.
Soon, it will happen, I'm sure.
It will.
Now you've got a number of alter egos, Ali. This is going to be so much fun. I'm looking forward to this interview and this conversation because one of my highlights of the last few months has been your good self as your alter ego, Pirate Penne. Now, for those who are watching, if you've been watching Freedom Kids, you won't even probably realise, some of the kids will be disappointed that I've just revealed Pirate Penne is actually a normal-looking human being. But Pirate Penne was a character you created for our Freedom Kids TV show. Tell us how that came about.
I wish I had a good excuse for how that happened. Tracy asked me to help with preparing some of the material. She said, we're going to do some challenges, and would you mind just, doing a short video introducing these challenges? And the first one was to do something with pasta. And I thought, well, I'll do something fun. I'll put on some fancy dress, and the only things we had in the house, fancy dress-wise, were a pirate hat and some orange glasses. So I put them on, and so I thought, well, that makes me a pirate. And then the challenge was about pasta. And so I thought, well, penne is a funny name, and I know that penne is Italian, but to me it sounded French. And so that is the origin story of Pirate Penne.
The origin story. It might not make a film, but that is the story. And if you ever get a chance, go back and have a look through some of the old Freedom Church archives from sort of March, April, May of this year, and you'll have a lot of fun.
Or don't, feel free. Yeah.
And do any of your colleagues know about your alter ego?
I did show it to my one office mate, yes, but no one else.
Okay, maybe we can change that and share that on
I hope
social
not.
media. Who
Yeah,
knows?
I hope not.
Pirate Penny, yeah, thank you for that. But your other alter ego, and the reason why we want to have this conversation today is you are outside of church world, when you're not a dad of two boys, when you're you're not playing the guitar, which hasn't happened for a while, or involved in doing French children's characters. You're a doctor in your normal world. Talk to me about how that looks for you and what kind of specialism are you having? Not just, obviously, doctor's a very generic term.
Yeah.
In the medical field right now, a very key season. What's going on and what's your role that you play there?
I mean, I found myself in a bit of a strange position, I guess. So I'm a paediatric doctor trainee, so a paediatric registrar, but I actually work full-time in research at the moment. So I'm what we call out of program. I'm doing a PhD, and my day job is working in the clinical research facility in Southampton. And what I had been doing was facilitating clinical research in infectious diseases in children. So we were doing lots of trials with vaccines, antibiotics and other things. And then I was also doing my PhD alongside it. And I still work clinically. I do 1 or 2 evenings a week in the children's emergency department and some weekends. But like many other people, when the pandemic happened, my work life changed quite significantly, and in a few ways, I guess. So one is that obviously my big part of my day job was vaccine trials before, and that certainly hasn't changed. In fact, it's become a much bigger part of my work now because we're a partner for many different sites who are running COVID vaccine trials. So we opened up shortly after Oxford for their vaccine candidates. We've been doing that since April, and that's been an extraordinary experience, actually, because I don't think there's ever been a clinical trial that's occurred so rapidly on such a large scale before anywhere in the world. So that's been quite an intense experience, and we're working on a few other vaccines at the moment. And then one of the other things that happened was through an existing collaboration I had with an international team of paediatric doctors, we early on saw that there was this real urgent need for information about COVID in children, because there was a lot of stuff coming out in the press and in some of the medical research that was mainly centred around adults. But as children's doctors, people sort of felt a little bit like they were in the dark and didn't know what was coming. And so with this collaboration that we had online, we started doing this project, pulling together all of the published research about COVID in children. And then the Royal College of Paediatrics in the UK found out about it because it was a bit of a sort of sensation in the children's health world internationally, and they offered to support us. And so they brought along some really great resources to help us searching for the literature and putting it all together. And so I've been leading that project since March, and we've had a few publications come from it. We've been cited by the World Health Organization, amongst other things. And so I've sort of found myself in a position where I've got a lot of quite important people sometimes asking me for advice or opinions about COVID in children. And then obviously one of the big questions over the last few months has been about schooling and how that all works. So yes, it's been a very busy time on those fronts, definitely.
And I know that the school piece is become almost your speciality. It's probably what you've become known for, rightly or wrongly, whether that's a title you want to maintain. But I remember a very sunny day queuing up for the supermarket together. We were literally 2 meters apart in the queue for an hour trying to get into the supermarket. And you updated me with some of this stuff. But I remember you saying to me how you were often getting misquoted, and you were having to spend that day phoning up some quite well-known newspapers and magazines to correct their headlines that actually were saying things that weren't true. Yes. That must be a challenge you're facing.
That was very stressful. Yeah. So that was, a journalist had actually tried to contact us to ask us about it, but we hadn't been able to get back to them because, they said this thing, can you speak to me today? Which we weren't able to. And this was very early on, and they ran a headline the next day that had taken a single sentence out of our review and it amplified it and stated that there had been no known case of a child transmitting COVID to an adult ever. And of course, once that's in one newspaper, it's in all the newspapers because of the way that digital news works. And there was, some quite high-profile politicians and other people saying kids cannot transmit this to anybody, which was not accurate, and it was a bit of a worry that they were citing our work to make this point, which was not what happened. So anyway, yes, I sort of spent a whole day on the phone to various media outlets and other organisations trying to get people to correct headlines and other things, which, I had a lot of support again from the Royal College who had been helping us out. But things like that are stressful, and you do get misrepresented when people know that you are interested in a topic. If you say things that have a bit of nuance to them, if people have an agenda or if people have something that they want to try and prove, they are quite happy to take what you said with nuance and to push it to a complete extreme. And so, yes, that sort of cuts in several directions. One, it's very frustrating because you don't want stuff you've said being misused, but then it also leads to a lot of blowback from people who think you have opinions or that you don't, essentially. If you say that something appears to be relatively low risk, then suddenly you think it's no risk. There's been a lot of that as well.
We'll come back to the whole thing around children and COVID, because I'm sure that's something we could talk about for quite some length. But that whole, that short sentence that tells a bigger story is the social media world that we now live in. And you live in a world where you're writing lengthy articles with huge amounts of research and multiple teams pulling together. And then I can see that happening easily. A short statement goes out online to try and encapsulate that. And like you say, lose the nuance. It becomes a kind of a headline rather than the fact. But the flip side of that is it has given you quite a voice on Twitter, because your other alter ego I'm in the presence of an influencer. My son Levi is quite impressed by the fact that you have a blue tick.
Yes.
And for those who don't understand a blue tick, please explain yourself, Dr. Munro.
A blue tick. So on Twitter has a process called verification. So you can be verified on Twitter, which just means that they've checked that you are who you say you are, and it was previously something that was held more for celebrities, so that you could tell that an account was authentically the account of Kim Kardashian or whoever. But then they did modify it for the pandemic, actually, because there's this big issue of misinformation and not knowing who you could trust or who had expertise in an area or whatever. So they expanded it to scientists. If you were a verified scientist who was researching in a particular area, then they would verify you that people knew what you were saying had some legitimacy.
So when I last looked, you were about the 18,000 follower mark, 18,000 follower mark, which has grown a load in the last few months. And your Twitter feed, if anyone gets bored in lockdown and they want to kind of have a good old read, some of the threads, there are some fascinating conversations going on there on your Twitter feed. Not all of them started by your good self.
No.
You sort of throw in a thought and let it all happen.
Yeah, sometimes it's best to just say what needs to be said, and then you just have to close your eyes and sort of pretend that the comments aren't coming sometimes. I don't know.
Amazing.
Yeah.
I'm very impressed by how you handle yourself online. It's a really tough world you're living in, where you're trying to, like you say, put across some detail in a very few sentences, and hopefully people capture your attempts at that. And I love the way you keep smiling. I think you've got a very gentle man online. I think it's beautiful. You're trying to put across some truth that as you see it, in a way that's appropriate. And I think a lot of it has been, I've been reading on your stuff there, a load of stuff around the schools, as you've mentioned. Yeah. And obviously, because it's Twitter, it's international. So you've got people from every country asking questions about children and COVID, and as you mentioned earlier, do children passing on disease to especially teachers or parents and elderly members of their family? Are you able to kind of give any kind of further thoughts on that?
Yeah. Well, I could talk for 2 hours on the topic. It's not straightforward, but to sort of summarise it, the initial concern was that children would be to COVID what they are to the flu. And what we know is that for influenza pandemics, children are a real reservoir of disease. So a lot of the spread that happens comes from a pool of infection amongst children. And this is why school closures are often one of the first, what we call non-pharmaceutical interventions to try and prevent spread. And what we found is that really doesn't appear to be the case for COVID at all. Children are certainly no more infected or infectious than adults, and there's a growing body of evidence that there seems to be less, which is really excellent news for children, because we know that obviously it's been clear since early on they suffer much less severe disease. They don't get very sick. But it also appears they very likely catch it less easily. And then there's some evidence that they spread it less once they're infected as well. And that's mainly for younger children, to be fair. So there's a much bigger difference for like primary school age children. Once you're up to sort of older teenagers, 15, 16, they're pretty much adults, which, biologically, they're more or less adults by that age anyway. Yeah. So it's what you'd expect. But yeah, so children have proven to be much lower risk than we thought in regards to transmission.
Yeah. And I did notice your frustration that the government was seeing 0 to 19 as children rather than primary age children as a very different age to an 18, 19-year-old, like you say, virtually an adult, 15, 16, 17.
Yeah.
And so there's a difference there. So the younger age group are less likely to catch and less likely to pass on, as far as you know. And that's across nations. I mean, I noticed that lots of people, doctors from other nations are dropping in information onto your thread there.
Yeah, I mean, some other countries have taken really an even stronger view on it. There are some countries in Europe who really, almost don't test children under 12 because they are so sort of convinced they're not an issue at all. But it's certainly something that's been seen, internationally for certain, is that younger children seem to definitely get infected less readily, and we just don't see much transmission for them. But it's been something that's been very difficult to prove. A lot of people have been understandably very worried about it, given what we've known from other pandemics, and it's really hard to prove something isn't happening. Proving a negative is difficult scientifically. Proving something isn't there, it would be much easier to prove that it was happening if it was. But the evidence has been that when people have looked for it, they've not been able to find it. That's really been the main burden of proof. And for some people, that's not been enough. They've just said, we just haven't looked hard enough. And that may well be the case, but it's not been found yet.
Still looking. Yeah. So you'd been an advocate of keeping the schools open. That's something you've been quite strong on vocally. I've heard you say that and seen you say that in print. But what about this idea of a circuit breaker? Here we are in half term. There was conversations around we should close for 2 weeks. We should give people a chance. Are you a fan of that model, or the fire break as they call it in Welsh? Is that Welsh for circuit breaker?
Yeah, they've called it something like that, haven't they? There is no easy answer to any of these questions. I mean, I feel sort of semi-qualified to speak to schools because that is my area where I've done the research, and my background is in paediatrics, and I understand the huge issues there are with long-term school closure for widening inequality, and particularly for vulnerable children. There are really, they're often already behind, and 6 months or more out of school is not helping people's life chances. You're talking non-recoverable damage that the government can't support. You can pay wages, but you can't make up for an education that's been missed, or for kids who that's their only hot meal of the day, or that's the only social support they get, or that's the only place where someone would notice that the child's got a new bruise or things like that. So I feel like that's been a much easier case to make for schools to be prioritised, because they're certainly the lowest risk population for getting sick. They seem to be lower risk for adults in regards to spreading, and we know that there are significant harms of closure that the government doesn't have other means to support. Yeah. So that's why I've sort of taken a stand on that issue, is because that feels like a bit of a no-brainer in some ways. In regards to the other ways of managing the pandemic, things like circuit breakers, and other restrictions, they can certainly be effective at reducing the spread. I think the problem is that really we're living into, and I remember saying this actually at the last church service we had before lockdown, was we're living in times of radical uncertainty, that no one can really be sure what the right thing to do is at any given moment. There's such huge trade-offs to everything. Certainly, the virus has probably taken approaching 70,000 lives in this country since the start, which is, that's huge. You can't discount that. And we talk about it mainly affecting the elderly, but we're talking people over 65. We're talking people who had possibly 20 plus years of life left to live in some cases. And equally, the interventions that are often being proposed to prevent that are taking away people's livelihoods. People who can't afford to, pay the mortgage or feed their family, without any real certainty as to when those things aren't going to be necessary anymore, as to when that gets better or how that gets better. So what I do know is that there's a lot of people working very hard to try and work it out and to try and get it right, and that no one is making those decisions lightly. And that there's not always a huge amount of agreement amongst the public or even amongst scientists about what would be, the definitive course of action. But we can't. Which,
as a non-scientist, I find confusing, because we've heard the phrase numerous times: "Follow the science." We're following the science, and I know before we started today, you said that's a confusing message, because it's not as simple as that. And I came across the Great Barrington Report or Declaration, which made this, lots of really high-flying medical people with great kind of, CVs told us that the way forward was to, to let everyone carry on their lives as normal and just lock down and social isolate those under, kind of at risk. That's my understanding in a nutshell. And then along come another bunch of scientists who are seemingly just as knowledgeable and just as clever, and with great universities and professors and Nobel laureates, all kind of went, we completely disagree with your science. So following the science doesn't look as straightforward as me, a non-scientist, a church leader, would love to. I'd like to be able to say to people, this is what it is, this is how it works. The answer is A, not B. But tell us a bit more about those kind of complications between scientists.
Yeah. So I think following the science has been a really harmful phrase for a number of reasons. I mean, number one, it's almost abdicating a bit of responsibility for people who have to make those decisions, because something that I've said before that I'm a real believer in is that science cannot make the decisions for us. So science can do its best to try and give you a range of possible outcomes under different approaches or different ways forward. So, if you were to do this, we would expect X, Y, and Z to happen based on what we know at the moment. And, because we're not 100% sure, it could be anywhere from this to this. And so, science can try and help you understand what things might help reduce transmission of the virus, for example. But there's a huge amount of uncertainty even within, what effect a lot of those interventions have. And then going beyond that, that doesn't tell you what the costs of doing those things are. So, for example, you could come up with a mathematical model. We'll have all heard a lot about the modelling recently. So you could come up with a model for how school closures would reduce transmission, which of course it would, because you reduce mixing of children and adults and other people, and you will have less transmission if you have less mixing. But that model doesn't tell you what the associated harms are of doing that, or what the trade-off is there. And again, you could come up with a model that tells you how much, if you close all the bars and restaurants for a year, how much would that affect transmission, or what you could get away with. But that doesn't take into account the people who lose their jobs, who have to, try and find ways to make ends meet and all that other stuff. And those decisions have to be made by policymakers who have to try and weigh those things up, and again without knowing all the facts, because it's all uncertain. And then even within the science, people disagree. So the example you give, the Great Barrington Declaration, which was arguing for focused protection, so really sort of isolating really vulnerable members of society and more or less allowing everyone else to get back to life as normal, and saying that this would actually help bring the pandemic to an end sooner, because healthy people who are unlikely to come to severe harm from the illness would then have immunity and the virus would circulate less. And then the opposition to that was something called the John Snow Memorandum, which is named up. Great Barrington is a place in the US where they signed the declaration, and John Snow is a famous British epidemiologist. This is where the names came from.
Okay.
But they basically said that this focused protection idea will not work for several reasons. One, you cannot cut off what would amount to probably 20% of society from everybody else, because it's not humane to the 20%. And number two, that's just not how connections work. It's not possible to isolate people that way. The virus will find its way in. If you have that great a burden of disease amongst everyone else, of course it will get its fingers in there and it will be catastrophic. And that nevertheless, even though the virus is less severe for younger people, it is still severe, and young people still do die. It's uncommon, but it does happen. And some are left with long-term, problems, complications following the illness. And so even that morbidity would not be acceptable or desirable. And I guess the problem is that there is relatively broad consensus amongst most scientists that we certainly just cannot stand back and do nothing, because the costs will be too high in terms of human life and suffering. But I think what people have struggled with is perhaps scientists not embracing quite the amount of suffering that is being inflicted on people in order to protect vulnerable people from the infection, is to talk about, I don't think there's been enough empathy in the communication. I think there's been a lot of focus on restrictions and not enough focus on the resources that need to be made available to people to help them to completely change the way they live, to try and help protect society at large. And I think that's led to a lot of frustration, because there's a lot of people who feel like they've given up a lot over the last 6-7 months, who now are perhaps feeling like they don't have a lot to show for it now that it's all come back, and now that a quarter of the country is going into various levels of lockdown again. So following the science, I wish it was as simple as that. Yeah.
So do I. In my world of church, and it's something, you're fully part of Freedom Church, and we stopped meeting in March. We used to have our meetings in a school hall, and we'd be hundreds of people in a small space. So we were like, that's not going to work anymore. So we started doing church online. And then in June, I made what I thought was a very brave announcement at the time, that we wouldn't meet as a church in person until 2021. And I remember at the time thinking, am I making a really dumb decision here? And we talked about it as a team, and we were like, yeah, that's the right decision. We can't get certainty, let's get clarity. So we'll give the church clarity. We're not meeting until 2021 at the earliest. And then in September, numerous churches started meeting again in person. And I found it very confusing as a leader of an organisation, going, have I made a mistake here? I'm looking around at other churches, some of them in quite high tier levels, tier 3 spaces, and they are meeting again. Yes, they're masked up. Yes, they're in their household groups. Yes, they can't sing and etc. But they're back in their spaces. And also, what I don't understand is, whichever tier you're in, it makes no difference to a worship setting. In a worship setting, you can have as many people as safe to do so, as long as you're wearing masks, as long as you're, working appropriately. And I guess as a church leader, I'm asking the question of the science, and you as my nearest scientists, and saying, what is the right thing to do? Because we've talked about this, and it'd be great for people to hear some of your thoughts around us gathering in person as a multi-generational church, the implications. I've got a lot of good friends who are meeting back in person in their churches. And I've also got other good friends who are saying we're never doing that for the next season. And so we're just as polarised within the church world of what's the right thing to do. But are you able to kind of speak into the decisions we're trying to make as Freedom Church with the facilities that we have available to us as well, which is a small office space and a studio now, and not a large hall we can meet in? As a scientist and as a Christian, as a member of Freedom Church, are you able to say anything into that story?
Yeah. Unfortunately, yes, I can. I wish it was. I I wish I had something more positive to say about it than I do. I think it's been quite clear from the published literature and the studies that have been done that there are scarce more settings, that are sort of more high risk for mass transmission events than organised sort of religious ceremonies. There's been a huge number of outbreaks, a lot of them particularly associated with singing, unfortunately, which is why that's one of the things that's not happening. It's where you take a situation where you have a lot of people in a small, often poorly ventilated area who are all socialising, so a lot of talking and communication or singing. And when they're all people from different areas of the community and who are, as you say, multi-generational. So there's two risks there. So one is that you're taking people who have come from lots of different areas, bringing them together, possibly infecting them and then letting them go elsewhere and spread. And then there's the direct risk, which is, we know that obviously for people who are older, it's just a much higher risk thing to get the virus, because we know there's a much higher risk of really severe illness. So, it's really difficult, and I think a lot of the stuff, you'd have to do to really make it safe would remove a lot of the reasons you'd probably want to do it in person anyway. I think that's something that is really difficult for the church at the moment, because a lot of what makes it such an important place for so many people is the closeness and the community, and really closeness is the problem at the moment. I think that's and it's not just a problem for the church; it's a problem for people even in the rest of their lives. But I think unfortunately it's a church service sort of has almost all of the ingredients in the recipe for potentially a really bad situation. And I think if we had been now where we were over the summer and there was that real stability, and we've really felt like public policy had things under control, then I think things might be different and how we might be approaching it might be different. But I think we can all see from the news that things aren't going perhaps the way we all would like them to be at the moment. And I guess you don't want to be the church that is in the papers for spreading infections to 40 different households or whatever. It's tough. It's a tough time.
We don't want to be that church. Now, I've said this to people before. We want to meet because we love people, but because we love people, we won't meet. Because the knock-on effect is the risk, and because, and I have this to people, if we had our own large facility that we owned, maybe we can make it safer, maybe we could do some work to improve it. And I'm aware of other churches who've got the large facilities with big open spaces. We hire a school hall, it's not really fit for purpose. We'd have to make so many different changes. It would cause huge amounts of work for our volunteers that it doesn't feel the right thing to do right now. We're trying to find new ways of, connect groups. We've got running groups of 6, and we've got coffee groups. We've got people connecting, going for walks, and different groups who are finding ways of connecting in outdoor spaces. And I think community can happen in multiple ways. But you're right, from a large church gathering where we're all singing gustily, that's not going to happen for some time to come. Which is a shame, because you're a musician. I'm sure you love that moment when you're in the band and playing and worshipping it together, and it's a great experience, but not going to happen for the moment and for the foreseeable future.
I think probably until it's stupid to try and make any predictions because things change so much. But I can't see things turning around to a level where people would be thinking about that being an acceptable level of risk until at least spring next year, I think.
And because you're right at the forefront of the whole vaccine thing, so do you get like the first dibs on vaccines? Is that how it works?
We may do, not because I work on the trial, but because it's a really interesting point actually. So there's a lot of talk at the moment about so vaccines are coming and soon. Within the next 6 months, I'm almost certain there'll be at least one licensed vaccine, if not more. But we can't make 7 billion doses of vaccine and distribute them within a year. So there's a sort of prioritization that has to take place, and there's a lot of discussion at the moment on a national and international level about once we have a vaccine and we're happy that it works well enough, how do we decide who it goes to?
Yeah.
And I think a lot of that will depend on the results of the trials. So if it is really effective at protecting older people, then in many ways it might make sense to vaccinate them first to get them protected, because they're the people who, a lot of this is about trying to protect those people, and so you can protect them directly.
Yeah.
But then equally, there's a lot of talk about perhaps vaccinating the people who are most high risk to get infected and to take it elsewhere, which is a lot of it is healthcare workers, so both doctors and people in caring professions. So it might be that, I get it. I'm offered it earlier because I'm a doctor, but yeah.
And will your vaccine win the vaccine race?
It's certainly going to be up there.
It's up there.
Yeah, definitely.
It's vying for attention.
It certainly is, yeah. I mean, there's 3 that are at a very similar level, and I know that the UK obviously has priority access to the Oxford vaccine trial. So yes, it may well be. My money would be on this one. Well, the trial will finish first. I mean, I guess the question is, if you have a few give their results in quick succession, and one is obviously a lot better than the others, then obviously that changes how you do things.
Yeah, when I say it's your vaccine, I need to be clear, it's not Ali's vaccine.
I wish.
The Munro vaccine.
Yeah, maybe one
absolutely.
day.
And the last question for you is, because we need to wrap things up here, is I'd love to be able to say, tell me the future and when will it end? But I'll ask you this question. What are your thoughts for Christmas? Because Christmas, families getting together, I know there's quite a conversation in the press at the moment around 6 people, will that work? What are your thoughts around families getting together at Christmas time?
Yeah. Man.
End on a high here.
Yeah, okay. So I guess there's 2 things to consider. So, and this is true of all decisions that people have to make about this. Is there's individual risk, and then there's what we would call systemic risk. So on the systemic risk front, lots of families who haven't seen each other for a long time from lots of different areas of the country congregating all at once is not a good idea, I'm sure. I'm making it sound like not a great idea from a systemic risk. So you'd expect that to have possibly quite profound implications for what happens to transmission across the country. So there's that to consider, and I think then that will be at the forefront of the policymakers' mind. And then on the other side of that is obviously personal risks, so your individual risks. So, if you're a young family who has, young family, brothers and sisters or whatever, then in that sense, a congregation of 6 people or whatever at Christmas time is not that high risk necessarily. I guess if you're a multi-generational household, if you are a caregiver for someone who's more vulnerable, who depends on you, who you have to see, or if you're wanting to see grandparents and things like that, I think that's another kettle of fish, because you've got to consider the unlikely but potentially really bad outcomes of that situation. And there's things that you can do to make it more safe, but you'll never make it completely safe. And people will have different tolerance of risk on that scale, particularly because there's plenty of people who are getting on in years who are vulnerable, who we'd want to protect, but who probably aren't that keen on living out the next few months to year of their life without seeing the people they love. So there's a lot of things to consider.
Loads to consider. We could go on for a long time. I know this is a massive topic, and I'm so appreciative, Ali, of your time. Thank you for your wisdom. Thank you for the part you play. Thank you on behalf of the NHS key workers, as we now call you. That's a new phrase in the last sort of few months. But I think as a nation, we've never loved our medics so much. But we are appreciative of people like yourselves who are thinking ahead and trying to plan. Thank you for being part of Freedom Church, and for the wisdom you've given into our leadership. So we've been able to ask questions of you, to make decisions. I've really appreciated knowing there's someone I can speak to, can ask questions of. But thank you for your time today, and thank you for answering our questions. God bless you. Thank you, Ali.
Cheers, Sim.